Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Lars and Kirili and their assistants for what seems a rather surprising invitation, one that I'm very pleased by, because it suggests that myth and legend have a function, and that is what I've been arguing for some years. Secondly, there's a handout which I should give you a little guide to. It's got 4 sides, of which the first 2 are very brief summary of the major features of the stories that I'm going to be talking about. The third side is a key to the sources where you can read them preferably in English. In 1 or 2 cases that's not possible. And the last side is going to be the most important one. It contains brief summaries of some of the oldest sources, plus the major points that seem to be common to a variety of these stories. In this paper, I want to test the premise that myth and legend are typically used as an open-ended way of investigating perennial social or psychological problems, and therefore that they can tell us quite a lot about the issues that worried our ancestors, and perhaps something about the issues that worry us. My theme will be the pattern of fratricide in traditional myth and legend in Old Norse, Old English and Scandinavian Latin. And I've chosen traditional stories deliberately, avoiding the quasi-realistic novel form of the Icelandic saga, and also avoiding the synoptic histories of Norway, which present several historical examples of conflict between brothers. But I'm concerned with what was traditional and legendary, and I hope that the reasons for that will emerge. Germanic societies are typical in regarding fratricide as among the worst of crimes. When a participant in an abuse contest needs something particularly damning to say about his opponent, he may accuse him of being the slayer of his brother. One example is Sinfjötli's accusation to Gudmundur in the first play of Helgi Hundingsbani in the Poetic Edda. You've eaten the food of wolves and become the slayer of your brother. And the connotations there are of treachery, shape-changing, and cannibalism. The best-known Germanic fratricide story is the myth of the accidental killing of the god Balder by his blind brother Ur. I'll return to that story. But it isn't the oldest example in Old Norse of this pattern, and nor is it typical, because all the other stories that I've found of this kind are connected with human royal dynasties. So we look at the gods as if they were a dynasty of human beings. The oldest sources are the Eddic poem Hlöðskvíða, which was probably composed in the middle of the 9th century, and 3 generations of kings in the Skaldic poem Ynglingatal, which is an account of the deaths of Norwegian and Swedish kings dating from about 900. You can see the relevant parts of that on side 4 of the handout. However, the legendary histories of all the other Scandinavian nations except Iceland show examples of the same pattern, and Iceland doesn't because it was a republic. And I've listed these in the first 2 slides of the handout. It's difficult to decide exactly how many examples there are, because it's sometimes difficult to decide whether we're dealing with more than one version of the same story or whether we're dealing with 2 separate stories. But there are certainly about a dozen, and it's probable that others have been lost. Some of them date from the pre-Christian period, but all of them were written down by Christians. That may also be significant, since some of them are about the heathen gods. Most of them share common features beyond the mere fact of fratricide, and you'll find what those common features are on the last side of the handout. Firstly, the 2 brothers may have synonymous or nearly synonymous names. The first pair of brothers in Ynglingatal are Alrekr, ruler of everything, and Eirikr, sole ruler. In what's probably a damaged Kentish murderous brothers story in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, they are Hengest, stallion, and Horsa, horse. In the Balder myth, they are Hörður, probably warrior, and Balder, war leader. This may suggest an underlying pattern which equates the brothers with each other, both the killer and the victim. The second point is that their father is either the founder of their dynasty, a king of the founding type, or an earlier king of the murderous brothers type. In Skjöldunga Saga chapter 9 and Fratricide Conference chapters 10 to 12, he is Halfdan, one of the legendary founders of the Danish kingdom, who's also mentioned in Beowulf. In Beowulf itself and in Hedrick Saga chapter 5, he is either Hrevel, the eponymous ancestor of the Hrevelingas, the name by which the Götar of southern Sweden called themselves, or else he is Huvud, which means simply originator. It therefore looks as if the pattern of the murderous brothers is typically a second generation pattern, and perhaps that it could be about sibling rivalry, but let's not write that one too. Thirdly, the brothers quarrel, but the reason for the quarrel is extremely various, and it's often seen as unworthy or trivial. In Ynglinga Tal and Ynglinga Saga, Alrekr and Eirik quarrel over a horse race. In the next generation of Ynglinga Tal and in Söderbrot, the dispute is caused by sexual jealousy. In Fratricide Conference and Skjöldunga Saga, the motive is envy of the heroic reputation of the victim. In Fratricide chapters 10 to 12 and 33, that it is the greed of a bastard brother. The reason for the quarrel was evidently unimportant, and it had to be reinvented every time the story was told. And that may again suggest that the pattern is about sibling rivalry. But sometimes, on the other hand, there is no quarrel, and the killing is an accident, as happens in Beowulf, in the Hatfield story, and in Hedrick Saga. Or the malice is attributed to a third party, like the Celtic enemy who killed Horsa in the Kentish story, or the trickster Loki, who is the traitor in the Balder myth. At any rate, one brother kills the other, but usually with an incongruous weapon, in an incongruous place, in a way that is demeaning for royalty, or by accident. Incongruous weapons include the horse bridles with which Alrekr and Eirik kill each other in Ynglinga Tal, and the mistletoe, or literally mistletoe, with which Balder is shot in the Balder myth. Whether it's really mistletoe or whether it's an arrow with the word mistil carved on it in runes has been a matter of great scholastic argument, but let's not go into that now. Killings in incongruous places sometimes take place in a royal hall where killings should not happen, or the victim's bath in Skjöldunga Saga, or at a feast where people are supposed to be in amity with each other. That's in Fratricide. Shameful methods of killing a king include hanging him in Ynglinga Tal stanza 14, and burning alive inside the victim's hall, which was regarded as a particularly dastardly way of killing anyone. Killings committed wholly or partly by accident appear in Beowulf, where Hafkin kills his brother accidentally with a bow and arrow, in Hedrick Saga, where the enraged Hedrick throws a stone at some voices he hears in the dark, and hears that the stone has hit its mark, and then goes to see what's happened and discovers he's killed his brother. And the Balder myth, where the bow and arrow is given to the blind Hörður and directed by the malicious Loki, so Hörður is morally innocent. The incongruous element in the killing, one way or another, is one of the most constant features of the story. Sometimes it may have been used to emphasize the unacceptable nature of the act, but there are instances in which the weapon used could not realistically cause death, like a horse bridle or a branch of mistletoe. And in those cases it may be being suggested as a kind of excuse that the killing was inevitable because it was predestined by fate. The next point is that one or more of those involved, usually the aggressor, is associated with an animal. usually a powerful animal, or with the heathen gods, but not both. In Ingdegatal, twice, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the animal is a horse. In Ingdegatal 12 to 13, the wife of whom Alva is jealous is called Bera, which means she-bear. In Saxo and Halfdanr Saga, the animals are wolves, probably a symbol of treachery, because the adjective "ulfskur," wolfish, in Old Norse also meant treachery. Where there's no animal symbolism, there's sometimes an association with the god Odin, the chief of the gods. In Saxo's version of the Erika and Albreka story, Ericus fights on behalf of a man called Gestum Blindus, the blind guest, or the blind stranger, and that's a common Odin name. In Skjoldunga Saga, the killing is engineered by the jealous Frodo, but actually carried out by the Odinic warrior Starkadr, probably as one of 3 killings that Odin compelled him to commit. In this case, the Odinic reference probably replaced an earlier animal allusion, because in Beowulf, the equivalent character to Arlo, the victim in the Skjoldunga Saga example, is Onela, whose father Ongentheow is killed by 2 warriors called Eobor and Wolf, Boar and Wolf. So that rather suggests that the animal reference in this story had been replaced in a later version by a reference to Odin. Therefore, perhaps, that the animal and the god are in some sense functionally equivalent to each other. What is the purpose they serve? Well, we can speculate on that. They might be totems, the animals, who represent or provide patronage of the nation of whom the brothers are kings. Or they may have been thought to receive the victim as a kind of sacrifice for the benefit of the people, since Odin was also, amongst other things, god of the dead, and human beings were hanged as a sacrifice to him. In either case, it is perhaps implied, although it's never stated, that the nation as a whole is implicated in responsibility for the king. Sometimes there's also a third brother, but in the Norse sources he's rather rare, possibly because his presence complicates the royal succession. He usually appears where there's more than one kingdom to be inherited, as in Hrolf's Saga chapters 10 to 12, so that you've got a spare kingdom that you can give to the third brother. Or where it's felt unacceptable for the natural drift of the story that would have made the killer succeed to the kingdom. If you disqualify the killer, you need somebody else to replace him. In Halfdanr Saga, there's a slightly different motif, but I think a characteristically high medieval or late medieval motif, and that is the good and bad advisors. Ulfkett kills his virtuous brother Ulvar for advising him not to betray his king, and he is then led into further evil by his wicked brother, Ulfr. They've all got wolf names, notice. A pattern reminiscent of the good and bad angels in medieval plays, like the Carmen of Burana Christmas play, or the Digby Mary Magdalene play, where you have a good angel advising do this and a bad angel saying, no, don't do that. Something incidentally which lives on into Shakespeare with the monologue of Launce in The Merchant of Venice. No, Lancelot Goblet. The murderer's brother is usually, the murderer's brother and his victim are usually succeeded by the victim's sons rather than the murderer's sons. But there are exceptions to this. The version of the Albreka and Eirika story in Saxo and in Gottrek Saga suggests that in that legend it was originally the killer who succeeded. In Hrolf's Saga, the victim's son becomes king of Northumbria and the third brother becomes king of Denmark. And the third brother also succeeds in the Hafkin story in Beowulf, although that was probably because it was unacceptable for the murderer to as he does in the version of the same story in Fratricide. Finally, the story often involves the royal lines of more than one nation. That's a rather surprising, but very common feature. And this may imply that quarrels between the kings of nations are in some sense like those between brothers. The circumstances vary, but there's usually an implied condemnation of the aggressor. In Skildener Saga, Frodo, king of Denmark, procures the death of his half-brother Arlo, king of Sweden, because he envies his military reputation. The opposite situation can be seen in Fratricide, where the killer is fighting a justified defensive battle against his aggressive half-brother, who has killed their sister and is now demanding more than his fair share of the Gothic nation. Meddling in another country's affairs is condemned in Söderbrott, where a wicked king of Sweden deceives his son-in-law, who is joint king of Denmark, into killing his brother. Treachery against one's own king is condemned in Halfdanr Saga where Ulfkep, the protagonist, becomes briefly king of Russia by usurping the throne, but it all leads to disaster and disgrace and death in the end. Conversely, a bond of brotherhood between the kings of Denmark and Northumbria in Fratricide is reviewed in a positive way because it enables the king of Denmark to empower his brother's son to gain his rights as king of Northumbria by disposing of their wicked half-brother. Now, most of these features that I've briefly listed here are not particular to the Germanic world, but they also appear in other stories from all over the world, and it's very easy to parallel them. For example, let's just take the stories of Cain and Abel and of Romulus and Remus, because everybody knows them. Between them, these stories provide examples of brothers with synonymous names, Romulus and Remus, both derived from the name of Rome. Second generation status, Cain and Abel. The bizarre weapon, the jawbone of an ass with which Cain kills Abel. The association with a totem animal, the she-wolf which suckles Romulus and Remus. And association with the gods. God exiles Cain, and Romulus and Remus are the sons of Mars. And the introduction of the third brother, Seth, who is the father of mankind, of course, according to Genesis. The succession of the victim's son and the international nature of the fratricide are not so easy to parallel, though the first may be due to a natural disapproval of aggression and a concern for justice. The international element is rather harder to explain. One might be tempted to see it as a reflection of the medieval Christian idea that the kings of Christian nations ought to behave as brothers to each other. That's all very well until you look at the example in Fratricide, which is quite certainly a heathen poem. So it's not only a medieval Christian idea. The concern for justice raises a particular problem in stories where the murderer benefits from his crime, and there are some examples of that. It may sometimes have been implied, as in the Romulus and Remus story, that a nation needs ruthless leaders who are prepared to remove anybody who stands in their way. This attitude may appear in the Alrek and Eirik story in the Historia Norvegiae and in Saxo's Gestas Minorum. In the latter, Eirik uses the killing as a stepping stone to a glorious military career afterwards, although Saxo significantly removes the fact that his victim is his brother, as he also does in his version of the Valkyries. More interestingly, Ingrid changes this murder into a mutual killing, and then, in the next stanza, does exactly the same again in the next generation. So Thjololfr, the poet of this poem, has something to say quite clearly. He is changing the story so that it's not murderer killing victim, it's murderer and victim killing each other. And in both cases, all the other versions, except one that is dependent on the universal, agree that there was murderer and victim. Theologus says no, they killed each other in both these two generations, and there could be a very good reason for this, because Theologus was composing for a minor king of eastern Norway called Rögnvald, and the most prominent political fact that Rögnvald had to face was the rise of his cousin Harald Finehair, who was to become the first king of all Norway. So Theologus may well be saying, beware of quarrelling with your cousin, you will get the worst of it. Or, at best, you will kill each other. And Theologus had his own personal fish to fry as well, because later on he was to become one of Harald's poets as well as Rögnvald's. In other legends, the blame is sometimes shifted onto a third party, the enemy or the traitor Loki, but this looks like an evasion of the problem of what to do about the murderer. Sometimes the murderer is killed in his turn in justified revenge by the sons of his victim, as happens in Rolf Saga chapters 1 to 5. But this is no real answer, because it simply transfers the problem to the next generation, where the same thing tends to happen again. In other legends, the murderer is exiled, as happens to Hafkin in Beowulf and Hederic in Hederic Saga, although both of these authors were probably aware also of the exiling of Cain in the book of Genesis, so there may be some actual biblical influence we don't know. If the murderer is replaced by a third brother, like Usulak in Beowulf, who, by the way, has absolutely nothing to do with his two brothers in historical terms, he is a historical character, they are not. Then that may serve to blot out the consequences of the crime. But the version of this legend in Hederic Saga is probably more original, and it's more of a nightmare, because in that it presents the alternative where the murderer returns to power with his capacity for evil enhanced. And that makes probably the original version of the story, and the unremedied injustice in this story leads once again to the pattern being repeated. If you do not solve the problem, you will have it again. Seems to be the story, the implication. The sharpest confrontation with the problem appears when the third brother is born for the sole purpose of taking vengeance for the murder by killing the murderer. Because, of course, the murderer is also his brother. So do two wrongs make a right? This is what happens in the Baldur myth, where Balder's brother is born purely for the purpose of taking vengeance, and he takes vengeance at 1 night old. Another impossible detail in the story. Well, there are two interesting 10th century takes on this. The poet of Vafthrûdnismál, probably a mid-10th century poem, seems to have regarded Valdi's vengeance as a praiseworthy act, since he makes Valdi return to the reborn world after the downfall of the gods, as one of two examples of the just avenger. But this view would only make sense if you thought that the murderer had cancelled his membership of the family by doing the murder. It might be a potential way of looking at it. But the anonymous genius who composed the slightly later poem Völuspá, which I would urge you to look at because it is one of the great monuments of early European literature. It's not just a jewel in the crown of old Norse, it is a fantastic poem in any company. Probably also a heathen poem, but this poem puts forward a much more interesting and challenging alternative. Valdi's revenge on the ill-fated Herder still takes place, but in the reborn world after the downfall of the gods, Baldur and his innocent murderer Herder will return and live peaceably together, but the avenger will not. So this poet is turning away from vengeance as a solution to the problem. he's suggesting reconciliation is, in the end, what should happen. In the turbulent world of the Viking Age, of course, it wasn't very likely to happen. But this poet at least had it as an ideal. And maybe, in the wake of reconciliations in South Africa and Northern Ireland, we're just a little closer today to that ideal than they were in the late 10th century.
Let me start with, again, thanking the organizers, Hope Carilli and others who put so much effort into this, and Polaris Waldorf for the vision and the courage of the vision of an interdisciplinary conference of this sort. It's sort of like cooking with non-standard ingredients. You never quite know what's going to come out of an interdisciplinary conference of this sort, but that's what makes it exciting. There are undoubtedly things that we will learn together in the next 2 days. I come here as a philosopher, and philosophers have contributed to the discussion of fratricide of late, both in analyses of the causes, tending, I'm afraid, toward monocausal accounts, but also in contributing to accounts of possible solutions. What I'm going to do today in this, I've written a longer paper that I'm going to summarize for you. If people are interested in the full paper, I can email it to you. But what I'm doing is more of a negative argument in some sense, arguing against the monocausal accounts that blame strongly felt social identities as the cause, the ultimate cause of fratricidal violence. As we know, the phenomenon of neighbor killing, which extends not just to our neighbors, but even to relatives and friends, is not really a phenomenon of killing undifferentiated neighbors, but of killing neighbors that have been identified or marked by specific social identities that are different in some respects from our own. This phenomena is not new, as we've just heard. It's as old as Moses. It's certainly from the conquest of the Americas, from the period of colonialism, in which conquerors took advantage of pre-existing group categories of identity and of pre-existing conflicts to make possible their own conquest. But this raises the question, in what sense, prior to colonialism, prior to conquest, were these social identities pre-existing? How much did the colonial discourses and the bureaucratic processes of colonial management create, construct, and change social identities in their process? For that matter, how much did the discourses of nationalist liberatory movements and nationalist bureaucratic machinery also change or construct out of whole cloth, in some cases, social categories of group identity? So the question here really is, what is the status of the identities that fratricidal violence is organized around, right? How susceptible are these to changes? Once we know what the nature of the status is, that gives us some insight into the susceptibility of them to change, possibly to dissolution. I think we can group responses to these questions in two large categories. Among those that we might classify as being on the right in some general sense one finds a lot of naturalistic arguments about social group formation, being rooted perhaps in the brain or in our prehistoric past or in human nature, right? So one sees, the sort of arguments that we're familiar with from Samuel Huntington, that cultural identity, social identity groupings are sort of natural phenomena. And the only approach to them, and the only approach to conflict between them that's reasonable is something like a real politics. Academics cannot theorize away these identities or their conflict. So that's one large grouping of analyses. Another grouping that comes more from liberals and from leftists takes an anti-naturalistic response, or an anti-naturalistic approach to the formation of group categories of identity, arguing that we can trace the etiology or the genealogy of social identity categories to elite manipulation, to market forces, to social constructs, to discursive formations, to a combination of these. And then they argue that given the fact of entrenched or strongly felt social identity categories in genocidal violence, that identities should be diminished or eliminated. This is a position known in philosophy as eliminativism or eliminativism, and it's defended by people like Anthony Appiah, by Nancy Fraser, by Jürgen Habermas. Appiah argues that we should make our social identities recreational in some sense, so that they become sort of like a sports fan identity that you can take up or drop in particular context, rather than something that follows you from context to context and is a motivator for your actions. Fraser argues that we should diminish thickly felt identities and move exclusively to market-based identities. And Habermas thinks that we should base identities as citizens on shared principles. So he's also arguing in a way for a diminishment of what we might call thick identities. Now, grouping the treatments of social identity in this way, it's naturalistic and anti-naturalistic, and I'm getting this in part from the way that Mahmoud Mamdani makes this argument in his study, When Victims Become Killers. Grouping them in these two broad ways make it seem as if these are reductively strategic arguments. That is that, there's a political motivation behind the treatment of social identities in both cases. But I don't want to suggest that. I don't think that's true. And I think that both naturalistic and anti-naturalistic approaches to social identity catch hold of some phenomena, some lived experience in a phenomenological sense, some empirical data that can be measured, some historical data, and are plausible and take hold and gain an influence to the extent that they catch hold of some phenomena, right? So then that raises the question for me, what is that experience? What is that data that we can measure, that lived experience? I share some of the hermeneutics of suspicion against the naturalization of social group identities. But what I argue here in this paper and also in the book Physical Identities is that we need a bit more of a realist approach to social group categories than the anti-naturalists argue. So I look a little bit at the history of the critique of identity. In the West, there's a long intellectual and philosophical and sociological history of suspicion and critique of identities. You can look at Max Weber, who argues that ethnicities are always based in false origin stories, mistaken or purposefully false origin stories that then produce reproductive communities that have what he called monopolistic closure and that have deleterious political effects. A reduction of public reasoning to something like special interest reasoning in favor of one's group, and so on and so forth. And it's interesting, in Weber's account, race and ethnicity are collapsed because the false origin stories that produce cultural identity or ethnic identity and then create monopolistic closure of reproductive communities then produces commonalities of physical appearance, right, and morphological commonalities. So something like a race is produced. So race and ethnicity actually cannot be neatly distinguished as they often are in the literature. Often race is seen as sort of the natural phenomena, the physical phenomena, and ethnicity is seen as the cultural phenomena, the domain of practices. But actually, I think that distinction doesn't quite hold. So from Weber, you can trace the critique of identity in the United States, very influential work by Glaser and Moynihan, also Arthur Schlesinger's critique, and more recent, sort of theoretically updated accounts from Paul Gilroy, Wendy Brown, Nancy Fraser, and others that all lead to an argument for cosmopolitanism as a kind of solution that will diminish the attachment to our particularized identities, enhance the capacity of public reasoning, and in this way avoid the likelihood of ethnic cleansing, genocidal violence, and so forth. Now, against this account, I want to argue in favor of what I call a realist account of identity, in which the political salience of ethnic identities is not reducible in all instances to choice or to strategic maneuver or to invention. So what follows from this is that given the reality of ethnic identities, it follows that any viable conception of justice or democratic process has to work with social identities, and pining for their disappearance is unconstructive at best. So what I hope will become clear is that the realism of my account is not a metaphysical realism or a positive realism, but a historical account. So the strategic account, I think, ignores the way, or the anti-naturalist, or the critique of identity account, ignores the way in which ethnic identities and social identities in general are explanatory, material, a feature of collective subjectivity, and a necessary result of historical experience. And I'll briefly describe each of these points. First, social identities are explanatory in the sense that they operate as theories. You can think of social identity as a kind of mini theory by which one charts and navigates one's social world. So if we think of them as theories, we can still understand them as constructions, right, rather than natural phenomena. And also, if we think of them as theories, we can understand them as fallible, situated, and limited in their explanatory reach. As such, and Mohanty has argued, identity constructions provide narratives that explain the links between group historical memory and individual contemporary experience. So they create something like unifying frames that render experience intelligible and help us to map the social world. In this way, identity categories we can also see them as subject to improvement, right? To increased empirical adequacy. If a given theory is inadequate, we can point out its inadequacy and improve it, and thus improve its explanatory value. But I think it's unlikely that we'll reach a period anytime soon in which all identity categories become superfluous in navigating our world. So second, the metaphor of navigating our world here is meant quite literally as a kind of material practice. Social identities are material in the sense that they're generally visible features of our social worlds, and they produce a kind of visual registry that directs us towards specific forms of interaction. Frantz Fanon remarked famously that he was the prisoner not merely of the idea that others have of me, but of my own appearance, unquote. And what he meant by that, I think, is that the visible morphological differences between human beings have been organized as a grid of status and essential difference. So identities are not merely a kind of discursive overlay on top of materially instantiated differences, but they're an organization of the phenomenologically accessible material world. Much has been made of the fact that eye color, for example, signifies less intensely than skin color, so as to suggest that the material aspect of difference really doesn't count for anything. It doesn't explain anything. All that matters is the meanings we attach to these material differences. And I'm arguing against that to an extent. Besides the fact that in some parts of the world, in some parts of Latin America where I'm from, actually eye color can count quite a lot. The point is that it's a mistake to overlook the visible features of identity. In some cases, we may well be trained to perceive differences, but what we're perceiving is not a figment of our imagination. This suggests that the solution is not going to lie in the hopeless attempt not to see. For example, to try to inculcate people to become colorblind, but rather to learn to see differently, to see more comprehensively and more accurately. Third, social identities are also ways to name the existing organizations of social practices, including perceptual and meaning making. And here I'm drawing from George Herbert Mead, who pointed out that we're always already born into an already existing and finely regulated system of shared meanings that organizes our self-consciousness, as he put it, from the outside in. So the idea here is not that there's a big brother who inflicts meanings on the individual, but that the individual understands the world and himself through collective social meanings in the same way that fans at a sports game will cheer or groan on the basis not of the sheer athletic skill that they're observing, but of the way that skill is deployed or not in light of the rules of the game. A great run will get cheers or jeers depending entirely on whether it's going in the right direction. So we could no more understand the reactions of fans at a game without reference to those collectively shared meanings than we can understand political actors as mere individuals. So social identities are like systems of collective meaning in which emotional responses, perceptual attunements, and intelligible reasons, the reasons that we take to be intelligible in public discourse, operate within a shared communal organization that affects our practices, our agency, as well as our affect. So fourthly then, ultimately, I think the categories of social identity are effects of history and refer back to the narrativized experiences of history in relatively conscious or overt or unconscious and covert ways. Macro events of history, like slavery, like genocide, like annexation of land, like wars, underdetermine our political responses and interpretations of them without doubt. People can go through the same macro historical experiences and come out with very different politics and very different interpretations. But if you go through one of those experiences, or your ancestors do, you can't simply ignore them. You can try to flee them, but they make up a part of your horizon, your hermeneutic horizon, to use Gadamer's concept here, that operates as a backdrop and an orienting perspective from which you'll make sense of new events. So the concept of the horizon that I want to import into this discussion is a substantival location. It's a location with a content from which we look out at the world, but it's also a perspective that's open and dynamic and fluid. And I think this concept helps to capture the background framing assumptions we bring with us to perception and to the effort of understanding. And the point here is that some aspects, not all, but some aspects of our horizons are group-related and thus shared by those who share a social identity, such as the trauma of dislocation, of slavery, of racist representations, of collective violence, and so forth. Okay, so these four elements provide a way to think about the real and realistic dimensions of social identity categories. Let me qualify the claims I'm making here a little bit, and then I'll end with an application of them to our topic. I want to argue that the discursive constructions and the state-based categories must work within the limits of these dimensions of identity. So in other words, the social construction processes that I do think occur to create identities have to work within the limits of these 4 dimensions of identity. They can't foist on us constructions of identity that have no explanatory value in our social world or no material purchase on our lived reality. So the state may counsel us to become colorblind by removing categories from all state forms, but if color continues to operate to organize our shared social world, then color will continue to be an important aspect of our hermeneutic horizon and collective meanings. However, I think there's a feedback loop clearly between state institutionalized authoritative discourses and our experiences, but the point remains that the feedback loop only works to the extent it actually produces an alteration of the visible registry or the macro-historical experiences that contribute content to our horizon. The second qualification I'd make is the obvious overlap and multiplicity of our identities. Social identities such as ethnic identities don't cordon off individuals into neatly bordered domains, but they inform and influence us across domains that are otherwise differentiated in other ways. So we need what some people have called a pluritopic approach to hermeneutics rather than the usual monotopic approaches that assumed a common tradition shared by all Germans, for example, or even all Europeans, as Gadamer envisaged. Okay, so how might such an account be applied to present-day conflicts over what identities are? I want to suggest that the answer to conflicting accounts will not be found simply by tracing their genealogy to institutionalized discourses and practices, but also by asking of the purported categories whether they make sense in light of the 4 elements above. And I've worked on this in large part in reference to the contested categories in the United States, such as whiteness or Latino identity. And although both whiteness and Latino were clearly elite orchestrations to some extent, Latino being the most recent that had, conglomerated a lot of diversity within one category for the purposes of marketing, largely, and for political interpolation. Still, they have taken root to some extent because they are explanatory. They do have explanatory value, and they do connect to visual registries and meaningful hermeneutic horizons. Let me look at the example of whiteness, for example. Some argue that some of the contestations over the category of whiteness today is whether it retains its meaningfulness as a political category, not unlike the debates over the concept of settler, alien, and native categories recognized by states in Africa. Some argue that slavery is long over, that it's lost its relevance, and others argue that whiteness is so imbued with the history of racism that whiteness as an identity can never escape that history. In my view, both are wrong. The legacy of slavery absolutely lives on in its effects on social organization, and the wages of whiteness, as Roederer calls it, explains the persistent differentials of wealth in the U.S. But the historical record of actual white lives is complex. Many families came to the U.S. in desperation, not totally unlike the ways in which Guatemalans come to the United States today. So the term settler is not quite apt for whites in the U.S., yet terms like, we might imagine, economic immigration or political immigration actually cuts across racial differences in some cases. We can make then, I think, meaningful corrections of false accounts of identity, which lead to new understandings of identity without attempting to erase them wholesale or necessarily even diminish them. Now let me try a very tentative application to Rwanda, which is a very different case. Mamdani argues in his book that the post-colonial state's recognition of Hutu and Tutsi as native and alien, respectively, continued rather than challenged the colonial legacy of identification. What has changed since the colonial government is the political valence, not the meaning of these identities, he argues. As long as the categories of native and alien attached to Hutu and Tutsi, he says there will be a continued danger of violence. So he supports the idea of diminished state recognition and holds that more comprehensive anti-colonial position would reject the categories invented by the colonizer for their purposes. And I'm simplifying his account. This is just a piece of his account, which is actually quite complex and mostly that I totally agree with. But I want to raise a question here. Even if this were accomplished, this diminishment of these categories, the painful history of colonialism and social injustice will remain alive in people's interpretive frameworks and affective responses. And it will remain true that history placed different groups, such as the Tutsi and Hutu, in different roles. Dissolving state recognition will not dissolve the memories or the visual registry of different status. So a better route than eliminativism might be to develop better descriptions of the actual histories and a more accurate account of the actual relationship of current generations' livelihood and standard of living to those past generations. Looking the history in the face, in all its undoubted complexity and multiplicity, can yield a fair assessment for reparations and will undoubtedly have the effect of reconfiguring social identities that are now made implausibly oppositional or binary. The route to reduced fratricide is through a re-understanding of our neighbors in relation to ourselves that is more explanatory, more accurate, which will necessarily make it more complex, and not, I argue, through a disarticulation of identities as if these are mere avatars in a computer-generated simulacrum. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I guess I want to start out with a couple of maybe comments, questions myself, to see if we can spark some debate here on the panel, and then open it up, obviously, pretty quickly to the floor. I guess picking up first on Linda's point, I think what's fascinating, and it's something we'll explore in greater detail as the seminar series progresses, particularly in the closing conference, and I think Kira Pels will address it in some ways, is that probably the most interesting and ambitious experiment in what you're calling eliminativism is going on in Rwanda right now, where the government has essentially banned the use of the terms Hutu and Tutsi and is trying to instill notions of that we're all Rwandan, and that these divisions were purely created by the colonial powers and by the Christian church. And in a sense, the government is betting on the ability to, I don't know if this is a great metaphor, but outrun the hermeneutic horizon. If we just give enough re-education to the next generations, then we can escape the historical construction of Tutsi and Hutu and get back to what we think was a prior history of Rwandese-ness or Rwandanness. Any sense of whether, I mean, again, you're arguing here sort of against the post-ethnic, post-identity utopias. That's what they're hoping for. Why isn't it going to work?
Right, I know, the aims are understandable, and I think you have to give very finely tuned contextual solutions in any case to look at the very, specific particularities. But I think, at the way you just phrased it, they're arguing that the Hutu and Tutsi categories of identity were created purely by colonizing, from what I've read of the history, and I'm not an expert. That claim isn't true, right? And I don't think it's good to base political policy on things that aren't true. I think what's happened is that, and this is really clearly true in the West as well, is that we've all become extremely sophisticated about the political machinations and the discursive causes of our concepts and categories, right, of political discourse in particular. So we've become very sophisticated about, we're all sort of quasi-Foucauldians to some extent, about looking at the constructiveness, the social constructiveness of our categories. And some people think, well, gosh, that means they're always manipulated, and so we just should manipulate them with a good cause. And it leads to a kind of skepticism, you know, a real philosophical skepticism. There's no truth of the matter. There's no accuracy here. There's just politics. There's just power. And I think that that's not true. I think there is still truth. I think there are better and worse, not objective absolutes, but there are better and worse historical narratives about the history of the formation of Hutu and Tutsi. The better historical narratives show that it's a very complicated matter. They don't map onto race. They don't map neatly onto class. There's at least a 35% overlap, you know, in some of the studies that I've seen. So I don't think we have anything to fear from the historical record, number one. It always complexifies. It always, almost always undermines binary. Now, in some cases, you might say, well, in some cases, we do have things to fear, right? The conquest did commit genocide against native peoples in the United States. The Nazis did try to decimate Jews, Gypsies, you know, Romani and other groups of people. But even there, the story is complex in terms of the relationship of identities, right, and the role, and the intergenerational question of responsibility. So I think that the way to go is to pursue, you know, more accurate, more explanatory, to really put the political debate on that terrain. And I think that that is the only way to ensure that the categories that any state or movement puts forward will actually work. Because I think putting forward concepts that don't have explanatory value in the masses of people's lives, that go against their lived reality, their visible reality, will not gain purchase. They won't gain a foothold. So that's what I would suggest.
I want to bring John into the discussion and I guess ask you a particular question, which is, if, as you stated at the outside, fratricide is seen as the worst of crimes in these particular Germanic cultures, but also in so many other cultures, why is it so often a founding myth? And how does that end up shaping the identity of the peoples that come out of that?
Well, I was very struck by what you said in the introduction about fear thy neighbour as thyself. Yes, fear thy neighbour as thyself. And it struck me that in these stories, the identification that is invited from the listener is as much with the murderer as it is with the victim. And that also, I think, links in with something that Linda was saying. I think very often modern discourse about conflict is unavoidably related to ethnicity. Now, the societies that I was looking at, they were, of course, great travellers. Norsemen travelled all over the known world, and they certainly came into contact with speakers of Arabic, Greek, French, Irish, any other language that was around. But there is no sense of ethnicity about any of these stories at all. They are entirely about the royal families of people who spoke what was known as the northern tongue. They had no sense of an inherent modern style ethnic difference between them. And even where you might think that they're straying outside Scandinavia to Russia or to Northumbria, say, they are doing so only in countries which historically had Norse-speaking rulers. So we're not talking about us on the one side and the barbarians on the other side. We're talking about a situation in which the ethnic problem has not arisen, but you still get fratricide. So it may well be that this is a rather depressing conclusion to arrive at, but we're not going to solve all the problem of fratricide simply by solving the ethnic problem, much as we need to do that. Could I put in a postscript to that, which is, it arises out of what Linda was saying about Latino culture. I was fortunate enough a couple of years ago to spend a semester teaching in the University of New Mexico, which is the only state of the United States where Spanish is an official language alongside English. And one of the communities that I was able to visit while I was there, I better not name it, was a small town where I was told this is the most ethnically conscious town in the United States. It is entirely Latino. And the problem was that although everyone was of Hispanic descent, they distinguished between, oh, he or she is Spanish, he or she is Mexican, he or she is Mescalero, and so on, with several other gradations which I now forget. And clearly, ethnicity has been transferred into a community that shouldn't really naturalistically have had it. So you can invent ethnicity where it doesn't exist.
I know somebody from New Mexico, and he always tells this story about ethnic identity there, that in his town growing up, if you were really poor, you were called Mexican. And if you had a little bit more money, you could be called Mexican American. And if you had a little bit more money, you could be called Hispanic. And if you had a little bit more money, you could be called Latino. But if you really had some money, you could be called Italian. And what I love about that story is that the way he tells it, I mean, people on the ground, you know, not academics, right? People on the ground had a very sophisticated understanding about ethnic identity categories. They didn't naturalize them. They understood that they're contextual, that they're strategic, that you can use different ones in different contexts, that they have a history. And so it's not the case that we're bringing this news to people on the ground as if, you know, bringing to the heathens the truth.
Great. Let's open it up to the floor for questions, and I think we even have Hope with a roving mic. For those of you who aren't American and don't want to really project. If you can introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Paulina Brzezowski, and I'm a senior research and advocacy officer with the Refugee Law Project in Uganda. And I just wanted to go back to something that Professor Linda Martin-Alcoff said. You said at one point that in arguing against the fact that identities are entirely constructed, you said that people feel that if they are entirely constructed, then we might as well manipulate them for a good end. If they're infinitely able to be manipulated, perhaps we should manipulate them for a good end. And what I wanted to comment on with regards to Rwanda is that I think a lot of times when people resist the manipulation of their identities, it's not just because that manipulation infringes on their perception of historical truth or of their own selves, but because they actually doubt the goodwill of the people doing the manipulating, the political goodwill. So, for example, speaking about Rwanda, we have a number of refugees who have been in Uganda for a very long time and who fear going back to Rwanda because despite the official line that there is now no ethnicity in Rwanda, in fact, they maintain that that Hutus are very much privileged in many ways. That Tutsis are very much privileged in several ways. And that, for instance, when people talk about the genocide, although the sort of official line is that it was directed at Tutsis and moderate Hutus, the moderate Hutu part drops off the radar, and anybody who's Hutu is automatically a suspect. So, for example, people who do go back after years in refugee camps are automatically subject to the Gacaca court system. which means they're sort of automatically accused of being perpetrators, because the question is, why were you away for so long if you weren't a perpetrator? So ethnicity, in fact, does still play a very significant role, and this idea that the government is trying to create an ethnicless state is just a cover more for the international community and for political reasons than a reality, which then leads to some resistance by people to having their identities manipulated in that way.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I mean, I would certainly agree that they can be manipulated for good or for bad purposes. I mean, I think in terms of that kind of wholesale association with Hutu as perpetrators, which has been done on the basis, and it's contested. But, I do think that we need to think about this in terms of the historical record and the complexity of what it means to be a perpetrator, right? So we can take that out of the binary notion of colossal evil and pure innocence and look at the ways in which there was collusion. Collusion, there's a lot of collusion going on, right? There's a lot of collusion in the United States today around various military violences that we're perpetrating around the world. And I think we have to look at that in space. I mean, I think there's a way in which we can't escape that. Any community that has been involved, and the individual, notions of legal culpability, right? We have notions of legal culpability in which you find an individual who participated in a particular act and then can be held responsible. And that's a very narrow and very specified notion of culpability that I think doesn't exhaust the notion. Philosophers have the luxury of being able to think way outside the box on this question. And so I think that if we think, not in that sort of legal, in the legal sense that courts often have to, but some courts are beginning to expand, we can think about what it means to be perpetrators, what it means to be collusion. And I think that's actually the route to reconciliation, rather than trying to diminish it, avoid it, deny it, or think past it. To think about it in its historical accuracy, which is going to be complex, right? And it's going to be, it's going to muddy the waters of culpability. But I think going through the category of perpetrator, rather than trying to avoid it, would be the way to go.
Other questions, comments from the floor? Yes, the gentleman over here.
Vic Seidler, Department of Sociology, Goldsmiths. I agree with the notion of not avoiding the notion of perpetrator and going through it. But presumably it's much more complex because people conceive these histories in very different kinds of ways within different groups. So the appeal to a kind of realist sense of kind of historical truth, which I'm not against in some way, has its own kind of difficulties in terms of somehow appealing to something which is kind of neutral, that we can somehow appeal to as a kind of historical narrative that both sides can agree with. And it might be, John's insight that in the Moors case, which I came later to, fratricide isn't something related to strong ethnic identities. It's just a helpful reminder about the very different kinds of contexts in which we're thinking about this. There's no one notion or one theoretical framing that's going to be able to unlock these very different historical and intercontextual situations. And we might, in response to Linda, we might see the importance, as I do, of recording some notion of historical truth and maintaining it. But do you think there's a danger that the kind of realist position stands outside, and for its strengths, there's a certain kind of weakness for looking for a kind of generalized philosophical theory that would somehow explain these different very different historical moments that we might have to think about in radically different ways. So in the Rwanda case, I have that same intuition. Don't deny the history. Don't think that you could just claim the notion that we're all Rwandans and somehow dismiss the history. But it might be that the traumatic, which hasn't been mentioned, the traumatic histories and experiences on both sides and the way they're reflected very differently on different sides have to be in some way worked through as part of the historical narrative. Sometimes that's missing in a kind of realist account, and that engagement with these different traumatic histories moves people on in a particular kind of way, but we do need to know much more about the historical specific context. So when that was said, I thought, oh, Yugoslavia, that was tried in terms of a certain notion of dissolving ethnic national identities, creating an alternative shared historical narrative around the notion that we're all Yugoslavs, that some people brought up in that moment regret and recognize, but it shows us something about the difficulties of being able to kind of reinvent or simply think that you can eliminate identities that have a kind of deep historical origin. But I'm even wary as I say it that I can think across these two situations, that one provides evidence, because I'm not sure that it does. It more feels like I've got to admit my ignorance and think through the particularities of the particular cases using whatever philosophical resources we can bring to it.
That's really interesting, and I'm in agreement, I think. I think that certainly taking eliminativism as the solution across context is a mistake. At the same time that we need to constantly be perceptive to possibilities of difference, we also need to be aware of possibilities of commonality. I mean, the concept of working through is a concept I like a lot. And it does seem as if there are some commonalities of trauma and of working through that can be useful in different contexts. I like that concept. Dominic LaCapra is somebody that I read a lot and know, and I like the way he deployed it. And I think the concept of working through does not need to be in opposition or separate from kind of realist notion in the way I understand it. Because trauma, is real, and we can pursue understanding trauma in a realist fashion. When I use the word realism, I should always preface it with post-positivist. Although that's just such a, flat-footed, dunder-headed sort of phrase. I don't like to use it in mixed company, but it's a post-positivist realism that I'm operating with here, which means that it's a realism that understands itself as always, it's narrativized, right? It's always, which means we decide where to start and where to stop and who the central players are. So it's always partial, it's dynamic, it's gonna change. We're going to focus on certain elements of the historical record at any given point based on what we're dealing with, what needs to be brought to light, what has not been brought to light, and what's the current crisis that we're trying to address or avert, right? So the realism means that we're not just operating on the terrain of political discussion or political or discursive debates. We're also operating on the terrain of what has explanatory value to experience and to the empirical record, to the ethnographic record, etc. But that's not to say that the realism solves all of the debates or tells us a final true story of the world, or that it's objective in the sense of being neutral. I work in feminist epistemology, and people are trying to reclaim the notion of objectivity to mean something like an expanded and diverse narrativization rather than an exclusive narrativization. So it's not about neutrality at all. It is about increased inclusiveness. So you do have to tell the story from multiple points of view. It doesn't mean that you can get all points of view onto one page and that's, the truth. Like Nietzsche said, if you imagine different styles of painting and you try to bring all the different styles of painting into one, it would be a monster, right? It doesn't give you any sense at all. So that there is a notion of inclusiveness, but it's not to imply that a total inclusiveness will get you the totally comprehensive account. So it's a very modified notion of realism that I want to use. But the idea here is that we can employ the concept of realism in a way that doesn't make us choose between a political understanding or a realist understanding in the old positivist sense. I think the politics actually is involved in the realism because there is a selection always going on in the narrativization. So we can still become politically reflexive about the real stories that we tell and the way we approach them. We need to build in a political reflexivity in the very process of realism. But we need to understand that we are trying to tell accurate stories with explanatory value.
Could I put in an analogy? It seems to me that many modern traditional societies face a situation which is very like the one that existed in Northern Europe during and just before the coming of Christianity. With Christianity came literacy, of course, and with literacy came the written record and written documents. And that is the basis of what is sometimes called objective history. History as the West understands it to be. Now, before that, you have legendary history. You don't know how much of it is factually historical, but the point about it is that it exists because it is needed rather than because it happened. And therefore, I think that if you look at somebody like Weber, there's a kind of, I hesitate to say imperialism about it, but it does seem to me that he's privileging real history with documents, and trying to decry traditional history, which is the creation of patterns which talk to the problems that you have now. They don't give you the answers to the problems you have now because they are explorations. And I think also that the reason why they went on being used in Christian medieval contexts was because they were not authoritative in the way that the Bible was. If you wanted to investigate a problem and you went to your priest, he would say, no, the Bible says this, you mustn't do it. But that doesn't solve your problem about the nature of how things are. You need an open-ended discussion for that. And that's what traditional history is for. And to diminish it as being inevitably the creator of ethnic conflict is to misunderstand it. And I think the same is true now as it was then.
Just leading on from that, I just wonder if we can bring back that idea of working through. I mean, do you think, that myths can help work through these sort of difficult issues of identity difference? I mean, we talked about ethnicity, but leaving that aside, do you think they deal with differences between the brothers? Are they marked out?
Well, that varies from one poet or saga writer to another. Sometimes the implication is they're Tweedledum and Tweedledee. And that may be the implication of them having synonymous names, which they very often have. But very often there is a suggestion that one of them has made a right decision and the other one a wrong decision. Like one is heroic and the other is mean, for example. And the mean one tries to compensate for his meanness by being even meaner. And it leads to disaster. Well, you could take that as a kind of moral parable. But on the other hand, am I the goody or am I the baddie? And if I'm the baddie, which sometimes you get the feeling that baddie is the central character, then what ways out have I? Or is it bound always to be like this? One hopes it isn't bound to be always like this, but there are some poets who seem to take it that it's all fate, and you can't avoid it. I don't think that's very helpful myself, but different, the patterns seem to not to dictate the ideological values that the individual version of the pattern creates. They're the raw material out of which you create a view. I hope that helps. At the back.
Murray last from you here. Just a small footnote, mainly to Norsemen. To what extent have you considered fratricide as actually about twins? It's a classic African phenomenon that one twin usually kills the other twin. And you don't have to be born at the same time to be twins. There's a very root form of twinning, and it's by no means clear that the senior twin is the twin that comes out first, is the second twin. So what I was wondering was whether you could expand your Cain and Abel, which of course in Arabic is Kabil and Habil, as you know, it's a pairing. Whether you could rethink some of your work in terms of notions of twinning and twins, and similarly the urge to unitariness rather than twinningness, and the problem of twins and power, which is an enormously pervasive anxiety.
It would be possible to do that, and it indeed is one of the themes of the very earliest sources for Germanic religion, that there seem to have in some Germanic peoples been twin deities who were both children of the father god. Whether they always kill each other is another question, and whether murderous brothers are necessarily twins. I don't think there are any cases that I can think of where they are, in the Norse context, where they are said specifically to be twins. It did occur to me when we were talking about ethnicity that there was one case I left out because it's slightly marginal to the story. And this is the story of the vengeance of the brothers Hamdin and Serdi for the murder of their sister by the Gothic king Jormunrek. They are not related to him except through marriage, but on the way they encountered their swarthy half-brother, and he offers to help them, and they kill him. Why is not altogether clear. Possibly they're taking out their rage because he's called their courage into question. And later on they regret that they killed him because they say that they would have been able to complete the vengeance against the king if they had him with them. So it's a folly story. But that's the only instance I can think of in which there is any ethnic connection at all. And the objection seems to be principally to his being, not to so much his being swarthy as to his being a bastard brother. So he's not quite kosher. So he's not therefore allowed to take part in this suicidal vengeance, which is their privilege. Very strange story.
Hold on, mic will come. Thanks, Robert.
My question is aimed mainly at Linda. It's
sorry, if you can introduce yourself.
I'm Nestor, an independent researcher, and in Venezuela there's a very strong political polarization going on at the minute, and as part of a kind of narrative that has been constructed in the recent kind of political history of Venezuela, one of the things is kind of, they started off creating aesthetical narratives. So there was some sort of like aesthetical narrative of how you're supposed to look if you support this side, or how you're supposed to look if you support that side. And that how you're supposed to look aesthetically, then turn into a more kind of ethnically based, and of course, it was a bit difficult in Venezuela to say white or black because it was all mixed, but degrees of mix would put you on one side or the other. And it's interesting how the political polarization was the force that actually drove forward the creation of these kind of modern ethnical or aesthetical narratives. And how do you actually tackle that type of politically led kind of ethnicalization, or production of ethnical identities, or aesthetical hiring?
Well, I mean, I think, as I heard Fernando Coronel argue, like in the very beginning of Chavez's rise to ascendancy, he was watching television, he said, this is all about race. And I think it has a lot to do with Chavez's obvious, part indigenous, visible identity. And that's sort of signaling a lot about class, it's bringing in other things as well besides that. So I don't think it's reducible to the political. I mean, I think that ethnic and racial identities, that politics in Latin America and in North America have been organized through ethnic and racial identities since the conquest. I mean, I'm a real follower of Aníbal Quijano's coloniality of power thesis, that the conquest organized economic organization through these categories of race and ethnicity. And that has been denied. So I think mostly what we need to do in cases like Venezuela is similar to what we need to do in the United States, is to bring that latent racial aspect of what's going on into the public arena of discourse. Until last summer in the United States, people were still talking about the Obama presidency as proving that we had become post-racial, that race was no longer a causal element in political opposition in the United States or in the behavior of voters in the United States. And I think with the Tea Party movement, so one thing we have to be grateful to the Tea Party movement for, which is that you can't any longer make that kind of claim that the United States has now become post-racial, because the racism is, right out there in the surface. So, race is all about what's going on with Obama. It's not to say that it's a sufficient cause. I'm not saying that all of the opposition to Obama, can be explained as the epiphenomena of racism. But race is a large part of the phenomena of what's going on. And it's a kind of white hysteria, because white people know that they're going to become a minority by 2050. And there's this kind of hysterical working through. It's not a good sense of working through, a hysterical reaction to this, in my view, many people's view, in a variety of political movements. So we need to bring that out to the surface. I'm still enough of a rationalist to think, like Hegel, you bring it to the surface and then you can become conscious of it and develop some rational, treatment of it. And I think in Venezuela it needs to be brought to the surface. And I think Chavez is a complicated character, and the movement, the various movements around him are complex, not reducible to this, but clearly he has brought much more participatory democracy on the ground than ever existed before. He's addressed issues of poverty that were never existed before. And race is a large part of what's going on, but it does not appear in the public discourses almost at all. And I think that's because we're very uncomfortable with identity. We would rather pretend that these kinds of identities don't factor into motivating our actions or our allegiances. And we need to become more honest with ourselves and more conscious of ourselves in all dimensions, bring it to the fore so that then we can develop more rational responses and less hysterical responses.
Okay, I want to thank our speakers both very much. There's always the danger, as I warned them, when you do something this interdisciplinary that we all end up talking past each other, and I don't think that happened at all. I think we could have actually explored following up on, I think, Hope's comment, sort of issues around narrative as well, but we'll save that for another time. So I want everybody to, again, thank the speakers, and then we'll move straight into the next panel with Omar and with Francis. Thank you very much again.